By the end of 1944, after a series of military defeats on both fronts, the Third Reich found itself on the defensive, both in the east and in the west. Faced with this situation, Adolf Hitler concluded that it was necessary to change strategy and go on the offensive in an attempt to alter the course of the war. The top priority was, without a doubt, the Western Front, since the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was rapidly weakening. A rupture in this coalition could change the course of events, and the area chosen for this attack was a region located between Belgium and Luxembourg, known as the Ardennes. Hitler's plan for the Ardennes was extremely bold. The strategy consisted of mobilizing an impressive army made up of around 45 divisions positioned behind the Siegfried Line, which protected the German border, and launching them against the American lines along the course of the Meuse River, with the goal of reaching the port of Antwerp. If the First US Army were defeated or forced to retreat, the next step would be to isolate the British Second Army in the north, in the border area with the Netherlands, trapping them in a pocket from which they could only escape by retreating toward the sea, just as had happened during the invasion of France in 1940. If the offensive succeeded, it was believed that Germany would gain the necessary time to produce its so-called secret weapons, which could lead to final victory. More importantly, it was expected that the Allies' defeat in the Ardennes would force them to reconsider their alliance with the Soviet Union, as a collapse in this region would mean that the Red Army could advance into Western Europe, something neither London nor Washington was willing to allow. Almost none of the German army generals considered an offensive in the Ardennes feasible, recognizing that it was a disproportionate idea driven by Hitler's fantasies, who had been at the head of the Third Reich for years and showed clear signs of moral exhaustion. Fearing that his officers might openly oppose the project, Hitler devised a cunning plan to ensure their compliance. On the night of December 11th, he summoned the High Command to a secret meeting in an isolated area near Frankfurt. Upon arrival, the generals were shocked to be searched and stripped of their weapons by SS men, who then loaded them onto a bus with covered windows. The vehicle took several turns to disorient them before quickly bringing them to Ziegenberg Castle, where they were led to a basement with no understanding of what was happening. Once in the basement, the generals were forced to sit in chairs while an SS guard watched over them with his pistol at the ready. At that moment, a door opened and Hitler entered smiling, with a confident attitude. He began explaining his offensive plan for the Ardennes with great enthusiasm, praising the brilliance of his own strategy. The generals, humiliated and terrified by the situation, had no choice but to nod and accept his words, knowing that their survival depended on it. They could not risk opposing the Führer. At the end of his speech, Hitler demanded that the generals sign a document confirming their support and participation in the offensive he was preparing. It was in this unusual and coercive manner that the planning of what would become Germany's last major offensive of World War II was carried out, an offensive that many knew was nearly impossible, but which they were forced to support due to pressure and fear. To carry out the ambitious offensive on the Western Front, the German High Command had to face a considerable logistical challenge. The decision to concentrate forces in the Ardennes required diverting troops and resources from the Eastern Front, which meant withdrawing entire divisions. In early December 1944, thousands of soldiers and military equipment began moving toward the German-Belgian border, with an impressive deployment of more than 10,000 railway wagons used to transport troops and material. The movement was conducted under strict secrecy, with extreme security measures, such as the use of messengers to avoid message interception and the nighttime transport of tanks to evade aerial reconnaissance. Even patrol flights were suspended, allowing the Allies to remain unaware of the concentration of German forces. In technological terms, the Wehrmacht was better equipped than at any other point in the war, just before the Ardennes offensive. Germany had a well-supplied army of men, armored vehicles and aircraft, giving them a significant advantage. The armored units, including the well-known Stüggi, Panzer III, Panzer IV and Jagdpanzer, were reinforced with the formidable Tiger, Panther and the feared King Tiger tanks, considered some of the most powerful war machines of the conflict. Hitler entrusted the main effort of the offensive to his elite Waffen-SS formations. The 6th SS Panzer Army, under the command of Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, was assigned to lead the attack in the northern sector, the most critical, tasked with breaking through to Antwerp. This SS armoured army included 2 SS Panzer Corps and concentrated some of the Reich's most experienced and fanatical units. Within the 1st SS Panzer Corps, led by Gruppenführer Hermann Priess, were the veteran 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, supported by the 3rd Parachute Division of the Luftwaffe, the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, and the Special Panzer Brigade 150. Alongside them, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps included the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, among other supporting Grenadier and Volksgrenadier units. In total, 4 SS Panzer divisions participated in the battle, forming the core armoured spearhead of the German offensive. These SS divisions, rebuilt and reorganised after the fighting in Normandy and the Netherlands months earlier, were redeployed from other theatres for this decisive assault, evidence of Hitler's heavy reliance on his most loyal troops. The Luftwaffe also played a key role, with aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational jet fighter, as well as the famous Bf 109 and Fw 190, along with the Junkers Ju 88 and Heinkel He 111 bombers and the terrifying Stukas, which remained effective in bombing missions. In addition to its impressive air and ground power, the Germans positioned heavy artillery in the Ardennes hills, including 88mm flak cannons and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers capable of causing massive devastation. Artillery was also deployed via Leopold armoured trains, which carried enormous long-range guns. However, what truly made the difference in terms of firepower were the V-1 and V-2 missiles, which had hidden launch ramps in the forests and represented a serious strategic threat. Moreover, innovations such as the STG-44 assault rifle, which would go on to revolutionize modern warfare, and the first night vision goggles gave German troops an even greater advantage during nighttime operations. Thus, while the Allies underestimated the scope of the offensive in the Ardennes, the Wehrmacht was preparing to launch one of the boldest attacks of the war, relying on an arsenal of new technologies and advanced warfare tactics. The plan was to break through Allied lines, seize key ports, and change the course of the war on the Western Front, all under a veil of secrecy that held until the very moment of the attack. Operation Wacht am Rhein, also known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Germany's last major attempt to shift the tide of war in the West. Originally scheduled for December 10, 1944, the operation was delayed until the 16th of that month due to poor weather conditions that were expected to hinder Allied air operations. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had played a key role in the German victory in France in 1940, was appointed as the main commander of the offensive. Despite his experience, Rundstedt remained skeptical due to the lack of fuel, since the reserves promised by Hitler were far greater than what could actually be gathered, forcing German forces to rely on captured enemy supplies. The German attack plan involved a rapid blitzkrieg-style offensive, launched in 3 main columns. The first, led by General Hasso von Manteuffel, targeted the central Ardennes, with the 5th Panzer Army dividing its strength into multiple armoured and infantry units. The second column, under General Joseph Sepp Dietrich, would advance toward the Liège area, also using several armoured and infantry divisions, aiming to break quickly through the Allied lines. Finally, the third column, commanded by General Erich Brandenberger, would take the southern flank, advancing from Luxembourg and moving toward the Allied positions. The German offensive was carefully prepared, with an army composed of 200,000 soldiers, 2,000 tanks, 1,900 artillery pieces, and 3,000 aircraft. However, despite the magnitude of the operation, the lack of supplies and the strong Allied counterattack hampered the advance of German forces. The bad weather initially worked in Hitler's favor, allowing the offensive to take the Allies by surprise. But the shortage of fuel and the difficulty in maintaining the momentum of the attack eventually caused the German forces to stall and retreat, marking the ultimate failure of the offensive. Despite its ambition, the offensive did not achieve its strategic objectives. Allied resistance, especially that of American forces, along with the rapid arrival of reinforcements, halted the German advance, marking the beginning of the end of the war on the Western Front. The operation, though initially successful in terms of penetration, ended up being a total failure, exhausting the last reserves of the Wehrmacht and irreparably weakening Germany's ability to resist the Allied advance. The Ardennes, a mountainous region spanning parts of Belgium, Luxembourg and Germany, was a difficult terrain, characterized by dense vegetation, steep hills, dark forests, deep valleys and numerous streams, all covered in thick layers of snow during winter. In this region, the US Army was scattered, weakened and demoralized after suffering severe defeats in operations such as Market Garden in the Netherlands and the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. Furthermore, the Allies were in a precarious logistical situation, as supplies had to travel long distances from the beaches of Normandy across all of France and Belgium, making resupply extremely complicated. As a result of the failures suffered at Hürtgen Forest, where German forces inflicted heavy losses on the US Army, the Allies found themselves with limited resources to carry out any offensive actions. In response, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower convened a meeting on December 7, 1944, in Maastricht. The conference included British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, and American General Omar Nelson Bradley. The objective of the meeting was to discuss the possibility of a swift counter-offensive against the Third Reich, in order to show the public that the Allies still had the capacity to take the initiative, especially after the defeats of autumn 1944. However, the offensive initially planned for January 1945 never took place. Ironically, instead of being the attackers, the Allies became the ones under attack. In the weeks that followed, German forces under Hitler's leadership launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes, a maneuver that completely caught the Allied forces off guard. This German attack would alter the course of events on the Western Front, testing the Allies' ability to respond to such a bold and well-coordinated strike. In the Ardennes, US forces were in a vulnerable defensive position. Their deployment consisted of an irregular network of fortified outposts and trenches, some very close to German lines, increasing the risk of encirclement and shortages of supplies like ammunition and fuel. In addition, tanks were scattered in small units, making them less effective against German armor, which included superior models such as the Tiger and Panther. Although the Allies had air superiority, their technology was still inferior as they lacked jet aircraft, and fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt had to operate without adequate protection. The deployment of Allied forces in the Ardennes was primarily under the US First Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges, with several infantry and armored divisions. General George Patton, in command of the US Third Army, also played a crucial role in the defense, mobilizing multiple infantry and armored divisions. In addition, the British Corps was involved, with infantry and paratrooper units, although their presence was more limited compared to that of the Americans. In total, the Allies concentrated 83,000 soldiers, 242 tanks, 394 artillery pieces, and 1,000 aircraft in the Ardennes sector. Despite these resources, Allied forces were quickly overwhelmed by the German offensive, facing extreme conditions such as cold weather and inadequate equipment. Morale was low due to the proximity of the Christmas holidays, further affecting the soldiers' readiness. The severe cold caused numerous cases of frostbite even before the battle began, leaving the Allies even more weakened in this inhospitable terrain. December 16th, the final blow in the Ardennes. In the early morning hours of December 16, 1944, German forces unleashed a ferocious bombardment over the Ardennes, with more than 1,500 artillery pieces firing shells across a 141-kilometer front spanning the borders of Luxembourg, Germany and Belgium. This attack was followed by the launch of V-1, V-2 and Rheinbote missiles, which struck the cities of Liège and Antwerp, causing chaos and terror among the civilian population. The US V Corps, stationed at the vanguard, found itself caught in this devastating assault, with no chance of repelling the attack. Trapped under a hail of shrapnel, the soldiers took cover as best they could, digging holes into the snow to protect themselves. The situation was worsened by the exploding shells splintering trees, sending lethal wooden fragments in all directions, resulting in deadly injuries for many who couldn't escape the bombardment. A new tactical trick added to the confusion. Along the Our River, the Germans used powerful spotlights to illuminate the low-hanging clouds. creating an artificial glow that temporarily blinded the American troops. This visual deception, lighting the sky as if it were day, served as the signal for German forces to begin their ground advance. As German lines pushed forward, 120 Junkers Ju-52 aircraft took off, loaded with paratroopers ready to carry out an airborne assault under Operation Stoße. The 3rd Parachute Division, led by General August von der Heydte, was the first to jump. However, the operation was poorly organized, and due to navigation errors, many paratroopers were scattered throughout nearby forests, some even landing as far as the Netherlands or the outskirts of Aachen. Out of the 1,200 paratroopers dropped, only around 300 managed to land near Eupen and Malmedy, creating disruptions and distractions in the American rear lines. The second wave of paratroopers, under the command of Otto Skorzeny, had more success than the first. The 150th Panzer Special Brigade, formed by elite commandos disguised in US Army uniforms and equipped with Willys jeeps, trucks, and some captured tanks, infiltrated enemy lines undetected. These commandos wreaked havoc by creating confusion and sabotaging US equipment. Skorzeny, with 50 men under his command that night, misled several American units by changing road signs or placing red tape to simulate minefields. Some groups captured strategic bridges over the Meuse River, disrupting routes to Liège and Houai, causing an entire American column to take the wrong road. Using the same fake minefield trick, another US detachment was unable to cross a tunnel near the Escaut River, while near Malmedy, commandos attacked a key crossroads, severing communications. Of the 40 jeeps that managed to penetrate the rear, only 8 were captured, and their occupants were executed for violating the Geneva Convention by wearing enemy uniforms. Nevertheless, the impact of these commandos was devastating for the Allies. Their infiltration caused absolute chaos. Roads quickly became clogged with traffic jams, while confused Allied troops, obsessed with capturing the supposed infiltrators, arrested hundreds of innocent soldiers. Additionally, at every checkpoint, soldiers were forced to pass tests on US history and current events, all while German forces continued their relentless advance. From a psychological standpoint, the use of German commandos disguised as American soldiers was a masterstroke. That same night, Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters in Paris received confusing reports from the Ardennes. Skorzeny's units, by spreading the false belief that German commandos were attempting to assassinate Eisenhower in Paris and Versailles, successfully misled the Allies. This rumor spread rapidly, and as a precautionary measure, Eisenhower confined himself to his headquarters while thousands of American troops took up defensive positions in Versailles. As a result, Eisenhower was effectively trapped by his own men for 10 days, unable to communicate properly with the front, giving the Germans a considerable strategic advantage by disrupting Allied communications. Another tactic used to distract the Allies involved the launching of V-2 missiles by German forces into rear zones in Belgium. These missiles, due to their high altitude and speed, could not be detected by Allied radar, allowing them to strike without warning. On that day, the effects were devastating, particularly in the city of Antwerp, where one missile hit a cinema, killing 296 American soldiers and 271 civilians inside. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the German 5th Panzer Army made contact with US positions. The advance was so swift and unexpected that many American soldiers, unable to react in time, surrendered without firing a single shot. Towns such as Marnach, Hosingen, and Holzum fell quickly under the initial German onslaught, encountering minimal resistance, which was easily overcome, except at the Our River crossing, where the Germans faced some light resistance that was soon eliminated. To the north, the offensive intensified when the 6th SS Panzer Army, under General Sepp Dietrich, launched a fierce armored assault against the US 99th Infantry Division near Hofen. The troops of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, leading the attack, were the first to clash with the Americans. US soldiers, using the cover provided by dense forests and hills, initially managed to resist and retreat in an orderly fashion. This forced the Germans to deploy Volksgrenadier units, made up mostly of young boys and older men, who, armed with the dreaded Panzerfaust, began to destroy US positions one by one, especially those located in foxholes and nearby ridges. Throughout the day, Kampfgruppe Peiper, composed of 124 armored vehicles and 2,000 men, advanced swiftly to Losheim, a key crossroads. However, a massive buildup of vehicles caused severe traffic jams, preventing the tanks from continuing at the planned speed. The traffic collapse was caused by the overlapping movements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, and the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, leading the group's commander Joachim Peiper to make a drastic decision. Frustrated by the delay, Peiper ordered his forces to ram through the vehicles of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, regardless of the damage caused. The tanks pushed through the obstacles, clearing a path until, aware of the growing danger, Peiper chose to cross a German minefield to accelerate the advance. Although several vehicles were lost, the maneuver allowed the German army to keep moving forward. By midday, Peiper's armored units encountered the 3rd Parachute Division, which had previously landed in the area after jumping from aircraft. Fortunately, the airborne troops were able to board the German tanks, avoiding having to continue on foot. Upon resuming their advance, Peiper's column reached the town of Buchholz, where the American defenders surrendered without a fight. After capturing Buchholz, Peiper's group faced another traffic jam, this time caused by a line of American vehicles. Without hesitation, Peiper ordered his men to open fire, destroying all the vehicles without exception. This devastating attack wiped out the enemy column and prevented the Americans from alerting their nearby units, allowing the Germans to surprise the troops in Honsfeld, where hundreds of prisoners surrendered once again. With unstoppable momentum, Peiper continued his advance along Route N23 and captured the Bullingen airfield, where he took 50 more prisoners and seized a fuel depot full of gasoline. Thanks to the capture of this depot, German forces were able to refuel without issue, giving them a significant logistical advantage. This success was critical in allowing Peiper to press forward without concern for supplies. Thanks to his bold and rapid tactics, Joachim Peiper solidified his reputation as one of the most prominent and successful panzer commanders of World War II. By late afternoon, the 1st SS Panzer Corps succeeded in breaking through the defenses of the US 99th Infantry Division, overwhelming them with their armored forces. This assault created a major breach in the front, splitting the USV Corps in two and cutting off communication with other American units deployed in Europe. As night fell, the remnants of the 99th Division tried to regain control by launching an offensive from their positions to halt the German advance near Heinerscheid. However, this counterattack resulted in unnecessary casualties and the destruction of numerous Sherman tanks. Following the collapse of their lines, the division began to retreat, relentlessly pursued by German troops, who bombarded the fleeing forces with artillery, spreading chaos among the soldiers as they crossed snow-covered forests. Near Lonsheim, late into the night, German forces scored a major victory by annihilating the US 14th Cavalry Group. At the same time, in Schnee-Eifel, they eliminated all American artillery units stationed in the area. Not far from there, German vanguards achieved another decisive blow at Clairvaux, where the American headquarters was located in an old castle. After an intense siege, the defenders were overwhelmed and a panzer tank crushed through the main gate, allowing German troops to storm the castle and massacre the trapped American soldiers inside. By midnight, the information reaching Allied headquarters in Paris was riddled with confusion, especially after the false alarm about the assassination attempt on Eisenhower. The only confirmed fact was that the Germans had launched an attack along a front more than 100 kilometers wide, stretching from the Ardennes to Luxembourg. However, the reality was far more serious than initially reported. In just one day, the Allies had lost nearly 3 divisions, and the German forces were advancing at an astonishing speed. The situation was beginning to resemble the blitzkrieg tactics the Germans had employed in May 1940. During the night of December 16th to 17th, the Allies took urgent measures to try to halt the German advance in the Ardennes. After the US Fifth Army was cut off from communication, orders were issued from Paris to send reinforcements immediately. The 106th Infantry Division was quickly dispatched south to secure the road to St. Vith, while the 2nd Infantry Division was transferred to reinforce the flank of the already battered 99th Infantry Division. The veteran 1st Infantry Division, Big Red One, was also mobilized. Unfortunately, the reinforcements arrived too late, as by dawn on December 17th, Skoseni's 150th Panzer Special Brigade had already managed to delay the relief units. Left unprotected, the 99th Division was ambushed in Elsenborn by Peiper's column, suffering nearly 3,000 casualties, including the dead, wounded, and captured. That same morning, Peiper ordered his column to continue toward their next objective, Ligneville. Upon reaching the outskirts of the village, an American Sherman tank destroyed a German Panther, but Peiper, having located the enemy tank through binoculars, bravely rushed forward with a Panzerfaust to destroy it. However, before he could act, another German Panzer fired and destroyed the Sherman with a single shot. After taking Ligneville and eliminating the few American tanks hiding among the trees, Peiper's column advanced toward Bullingen, penetrating more than 6 kilometers into the American lines. Despite receiving orders not to push too far and to leave troops on the flanks, Peiper disobeyed and pressed forward toward the Meuse River, annihilating scattered units of the US 9th Armored Division. By the end of December 17th, the Allies finally understood the seriousness of the situation. Eisenhower gave the immediate order to mobilize the 82nd and 101st US Airborne Divisions and selected Patton's US 3rd Armored Army to assist the forces being overwhelmed in the Ardennes. The main challenge with this maneuver was that Patton's forces were still far from the front, meaning they could not arrive quickly, which left the remaining Allied units with only one viable option: resist until exhaustion. Malmedy and Chenogne, war crimes in the Ardennes, December 17, 1944, became a dark day for Allied forces, particularly the United States Army, following the discovery of the horrific Malmedy massacre, an act of brutality carried out by Waffen-SS soldiers belonging to Kampfgruppe Peiper. The tragedy occurred when 84 American prisoners of war were coldly executed in the small town of Malmedy, Belgium, just weeks into the German Ardennes offensive. The prisoners, who had been captured and were unarmed, were shot without warning in a mass execution that left a deep impact on Allied troops. News of the Malmedy massacre spread quickly, and its effect was immediate. Allied media used the event as a symbol of the cruelty of German troops, and the story served as a grim reminder of why the Allies were fighting the Third Reich. The bodies of the victims, found frozen in the snow, served as further proof of the barbarity inflicted on prisoners of war and sparked widespread outrage within US ranks. The massacre itself was not only a reminder of the deep-seated hatred between both sides, but also revealed the fierce nature of the battle raging in the Ardennes. As the German advance intensified and US forces were overwhelmed, feelings of revenge and desperation grew rapidly among Allied soldiers. While Malmedy became a symbol of the atrocities committed by German forces, few knew at the time that this was not an isolated crime. In the weeks following the tragedy, the Allies would discover that American forces also committed war crimes in retaliation for German atrocities. The Chenogne massacre, another grim episode during the Battle of the Ardennes, reveals an often overlooked aspect of war crimes committed by the Allies. While the Malmedy massacre was widely publicized and condemned, the killing of German prisoners in Chenogne remained hidden for a long time. This massacre, which took place in January 1945, was a direct reprisal for the crimes committed in Malmedy. A significant number of German prisoners were executed by US soldiers, in much the same way as the American prisoners had been in Malmedy. However, unlike Malmedy, the events at Chenogne were kept secret for years, largely due to the lack of surviving witnesses and the US High Command's refusal to investigate or acknowledge the incident. The Chenogne massacre occurred when 70 to 80 German prisoners were coldly executed by soldiers of the US 11th Armored Division near the Belgian village of Chenogne, about 75 kilometers from Malmedy. Unlike Malmedy, where some prisoners managed to escape and later report the massacre, there were no survivors in Chenogne. The prisoners were lined up along the roadside in full view of American troops and machine-gunned without mercy. The details were so chilling that even some of the American soldiers involved reportedly felt deeply disturbed by what had happened, though few dared to speak up at the time. The context of the massacre is crucial to understanding the atmosphere of animosity and revenge that permeated the front lines at the time. The news of Malmedy had spread like wildfire, and the desire for vengeance took hold of many US soldiers who saw these German prisoners as a way to release their grief and rage over the loss of their comrades. While there were no official orders to execute prisoners, the general attitude was that, after what had happened at Malmedy, no mercy should be shown to captured German soldiers. Testimonies from participants like Corporal John Faig, who was present during the massacre, confirmed that there was a clear intent to punish the Germans for prior crimes, regardless of the legal or moral consequences. Although the Showdown massacre never received the same level of media attention as Malmedy, its impact was significant. The cover-up of this crime, largely due to the US military's refusal to investigate, left an open wound that remained buried under official history for many years. However, with time and through the work of historians like Anthony Beaver and Krista Bergstrom, the truth about Showdown began to surface. These investigations uncovered the chilling details of what occurred and challenged the traditional narrative of war crimes during World War II, which often focused exclusively on the atrocities committed by Axis forces. The last fortress, the heroic resistance of St. Vith in the Ardennes. The battle for St. Vith began in the early hours of December 18, 1944, when the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division launched a fierce assault on the town, located along the Our River, where US forces were positioned along the Monschau-Elsenborn line. By that point, German troops had advanced to within just 500 meters of their objective, and after destroying 3 Sherman tanks, they managed to take control of the hills near Wallerode Mill. With dominance over this key position, the German forces quickly overwhelmed the American troops, destroying 4 more tanks and forcing them to retreat toward the center of St. Vith, where they hoped to reorganize and withstand a prolonged offensive. Several kilometers away from St. Vith, Kampfgruppe Peiper's column continued its advance at dawn, defeating American forces in Stavelot with little resistance and razing the town completely. Peiper's troops then rapidly advanced toward Trois-Ponts, but their progress was temporarily halted when a small group of 13 US engineers, led by Sergeant Charles Hensel, blew up the bridge over the Amblev River. Facing this obstacle, Peiper chose to reroute toward La Gleize, but by the afternoon a squadron of P-51 Mustangs located the German column and destroyed 10 of its tanks. After this blow, delayed American units counterattacked in Stavelot, forcing Peiper to alter his direction once again. Ironically, just 500 meters from Stavelot, the Germans overlooked a fuel depot containing 11 million tons of gasoline, a cache that, if discovered, could have provided them with enough fuel to continue their advance into Belgium. Due to the threat posed by Peiper's proximity to the US headquarters in Spa, American forces decided to partially evacuate further into Belgium after learning that German armored vanguards had secured the banks of the Lienne River and the village of Habiemont. On the night of December 18th, the US 9th Armored Division faced off against the 2nd Panzer Division, losing all of its tanks one after another. This defeat opened the road to Bastogne, allowing the 5th Panzer Army to advance throughout the night, eventually encountering the 101st US Airborne Division. Despite the adverse conditions, the paratroopers managed to halt the German advance near Bastogne. However, their bravery came at a high cost, as they lost an entire regiment in the process. The last fortress, the heroic resistance of St. Vith in the Ardennes, Part 2. In the early hours of December 19, 1944, German forces took control of Schnee-Eifel, while the 3 divisions that had attacked St. Vith annihilated 2 US infantry regiments. Meanwhile, to the north, Kampfgruppe Peiper occupied the town of Stoumont, capturing 284 American prisoners and destroying several Sherman tanks and an Me-3 anti-aircraft gun, while the Germans lost only 3 Panther tanks in the process. For more than 3 days of intense fighting, Liège and Antwerp were bombarded by a rain of V-1 and V-2 missiles, spreading panic and chaos among civilians and Allied occupation forces. The Deurne airfield, vital for the Allies, was also hit by these missiles. The launch bases and ramps, strategically placed and well camouflaged in the Ardennes forests, were hard to detect from the air, making the strikes even more effective. These bombings caused numerous casualties, mostly Belgian civilians, and severely disrupted Allied supply lines and troop movements. On December 20th, due to a critical fuel shortage, Kampfgruppe Peiper was forced to come to a complete halt, allowing the US 82nd Airborne Division to retreat deeper into St. Vith along with the remaining armored units. However, the Allies barely had time to regroup before, on December 21st, the Germans launched an assault from the northwest against St. Vith. After defeating 3 M10 tanks, They took Breitfeld and advanced to the town's entrance, where German grenadiers, armed with Panzerfausts, destroyed 5 Sherman tanks. This setback forced the Americans to reduce their defensive perimeter to a narrow strip within the ruins of St. Vith. Further south in Schönberg, the 18th Volksgrenadier Division wiped out the last remnants of the US 106th Infantry Division near Schnee-Eifel Mountain. Over 10,000 American soldiers were captured as they emerged from the forests, surrendering with hands raised. This defeat marked a critical point in the offensive, becoming one of the greatest tactical humiliations for the US Army during the war. After several failed attempts, on December 22nd and 23rd, King Tiger and Panther tanks launched a direct assault on St. Vith, wiping out the last remaining US Shermans. During the attack, many American tank crews, fearing they would be burned alive by enemy fire, abandoned their vehicles and joined the retreating infantry. However, some drivers chose to face the situation bravely, launching suicidal charges. One such instance involved 5 Shermans attempting to attack a platoon of 6 Stugs on a steep hill, but the German guns quickly set them ablaze. Thanks to these successful maneuvers, the morning of December 23rd brought the collapse of the final American resistance in the western sector of the city, allowing German forces to enter St. Vith. This victory came at a high cost for the Allies. The US 7th Armored Division was completely wiped out, and the 9th Armored Division suffered heavy losses, with its few surviving members forced to flee toward the Somme River, but not before German troops seized the riverbanks. Up to that point, the Battle of St. Vith had turned into a disaster for the US Army, which suffered a devastating defeat. The casualties were enormous. Over 14,000 soldiers, including 3,397 killed or wounded, and 10,000 captured. Additionally, 140 tanks and numerous vehicles and artillery pieces were destroyed. By contrast, German forces suffered only 2,800 casualties, a relatively low number compared to their opponents, making it a decisive victory for the Wehrmacht. Curiously, not only German soldiers celebrated the victory, but also the local population of St. Vith, predominantly of German origin, who hung swastika flags from their windows and balconies in support. With the fall of St. Vith, the town of Bastogne was now completely isolated, trapping within it the US 10 Honest Airborne Division. Bastogne would become the final obstacle between the German forces and the Meuse River, just as George Patton's Third Army began its advance toward the city. Bastogne would be the place where the fate of the Ardennes campaign would ultimately be decided. December 24th. An unexpected sunny day surprises the Germans. On December 24th, an unexpected sunny day took the Germans by surprise. This change in weather conditions allowed Allied aviation to take off, attacking German supply lines and destroying vehicles and tanks on nearby roads. At the same time, US C-47 Dakota planes carried out more than 3,000 flights to drop supplies and ammunition to the 101st Airborne Division forces trapped in the city. Thanks to these supplies, the American soldiers were able to celebrate Christmas Eve, sharing food rations and enjoying small Christmas gifts that had been airdropped to them. December 25th, Christmas Day under fire. On December 25th, Christmas Day, the German 5th Panzer Army resumed its attack on Bastogne, ignoring the planned advance toward the Meuse River. However, the German soldiers were soon caught off guard by the fierce fire from American artillery and bazookas, which set the approaching Panzer tanks ablaze. Meanwhile, German infantry forces were also severely attacked by American machine guns. Although German troops managed to penetrate some streets of Bastogne, the American resistance repelled them, destroying several German tanks. In retaliation for the stubborn defense, during the night, the Luftwaffe carried out an intense bombing over the city, causing numerous casualties among both soldiers and the civilian population. Fighting continues across the Ardennes. While the Battle of Bastogne continued, other fronts in the Ardennes also saw intense fighting. The German 6th Panzer Army continued advancing through the forests, managing to take La Roche. At the same time, on December 26th, the 2nd Panzer Division captured the towns of Rochefort and Celle, located near the Meuse River, just before the German tanks ran out of fuel. The furthest position reached by German forces was Foy-Notre-Dame, marking an advance of 100 kilometers into the interior of Belgium, which was not surpassed. Despite this German progress, the troops of the US First Army put up fierce resistance, managing to halt the Wehrmacht's advance in places like Fréthur, Mannheim, Hotten, Marsch, Grandmesnil, Houffalize, Bowring, and the outskirts of Dinant. As a result of this tenacious defense, the Americans destroyed 86 German tanks, 83 cannons, and 280 trucks. Meanwhile, Peiper's column, advancing independently, had no better luck. His forces were surrounded in Le Gleize after suffering heavy losses. However, thanks to his tactical cunning, Peiper managed to open a gap in the enemy lines and allowed his forces to escape, returning to German territory. Despite this escape, the losses were devastating. 36 tanks, including 15 Panthers, 8 Stugs, 7 King Tigers and 6 Panzer IVs, 70 Hanomag half-tracks, 12 SDKFZ armoured vehicles, 5 20mm anti-aircraft guns, 1 Flak 88 gun, 6 120mm mortars, and 888 casualties including dead, wounded and prisoners. Patton's Third Armoured Army breaks through to Bastogne. Patton's Third Armoured Army advanced rapidly toward Bastogne, smashing through everything in its path, including German troops and armoured vehicles. However, its progress was slowed by barricades and obstacles placed by German engineers, who felled trees and created other blockades in an attempt to delay the advance. Additionally, ambushes by German paratroopers, such as the one at the Chaumont hunting lodge, cost the Americans 11 destroyed Sherman tanks and 65 dead soldiers. Despite these difficulties, Patton's advance had a positive moral effect on the besieged forces, as by midday on December 23rd, some units of the 101st Airborne Division emerged from their shelters upon learning that Patton's forces were approaching. While the paratroopers held off the German attack, Patton's forces flanked the encirclement from the south, opening fire with their tanks and forcing the Germans to retreat. Although Patton's troops finally broke the siege at 1650 on December 31st, the Battle of Bastogne continued in the following days. Between December 27th and 30th, fighting took place around the city, including a fierce armoured battle between 50 Panzer IVs and 350 American Shermans, which ended in a German victory, though the numerical superiority of the Americans soon became evident. The Wehrmacht, still resisting in some areas, suffered heavy losses, with 30 Shermans destroyed and ongoing attrition that reduced German armies to an unsustainable situation. Allied aviation also played a key role, destroying much of the German columns in both Bastogne and other parts of the Ardennes, while Belgian and Luxembourgish resistance fighters contributed with effective sabotage to halt German advances. Frustrated by the failure of the German offensive, Hitler from Berlin ordered a general withdrawal to the Siegfried Line. On December 31st, the US Army regained full control of Bastogne and one-third of the Ardennes. However, the Germans still had a contingency plan prepared in case Operation Wacht am Rhein failed, known as Operation Bodenplatte, which was to be carried out in secret. The Ardennes offensive and its accompanying operations cost Germany 80,000 men and exhausted a significant portion of the country's already low fuel reserves. Hitler refused to accept that the Battle of the Ardennes had been a failure comparable to the Kaiserschlacht, Germany's last great offensive of World War I, and obsessively rejected any parallels with 1918, which to him symbolized only the revolutionary betrayal that overthrew the Kaiser and led to a humiliating defeat for Germany. "We will never surrender. We may perish, but the whole world will fall with us," he declared vehemently. General Guderian, horrified by the looming disaster on the Eastern Front, returned to the Führer's headquarters twice more in close succession. During his visit on New Year's Day, Guderian encountered the annual procession of regime dignitaries and general staff chiefs coming to deliver their personal New Year's wishes to the Führer. That same morning, Operation North Wind, the main supporting action of the Ardennes offensive, had been launched in Alsace. The day turned out to be catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. In a characteristically irresponsible move, Göring deployed nearly 1,000 aircraft to attack ground targets on the Western Front. This attempt to impress Hitler resulted in the total destruction of the Luftwaffe and granted the Allies complete air supremacy. That same day, German state radio broadcast Hitler's New Year's address. In it, there was no mention of the fighting in the West, an omission that highlights the failure of the offensive. And surprisingly, there was also no reference to the Wunderwaffen. At the beginning of the new year, the Führer addressed the German people from his headquarters. German people, National Socialists, my fellow citizens. The events of the past 12 months have compelled me to dedicate a great portion of my time and effort, all my attention and energy, to the one task for which I have lived for so many years, the struggle for the destiny of my people. Operation Bodenplatte, the last aerial breath of the Third Reich operation. Bodenplatte was an extreme measure devised by Hitler in case the offensive in the Ardennes failed. While German forces, both from the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, fortified positions in the eastern part of the Ardennes in anticipation of a future counter-offensive, the Luftwaffe was tasked with executing a decisive aerial attack. The main objective of this operation was to annihilate the Allied air forces in the region, covering Belgium, the Netherlands and northern France, and then focus efforts on eliminating enemy ground forces. To carry out the operation, several airfields were established in Germany, from which Luftwaffe aircraft would take off. The aim was to deal a deadly blow to Allied aviation in the targeted regions, neutralizing their ability to respond and exposing their ground positions. For their part, the Allies also had strategic airfields in Belgium, France and the Netherlands, which were to be attacked to hinder their movements. The operation, whose purpose was to alter the course of the war, became a desperate attempt to shift the direction of the air and ground conflict in Europe. On the night of December 31, 1944, Luftwaffe pilots received strict orders ahead of Operation Bodenplatte. They were instructed to avoid New Year's Eve celebrations, abstain from consuming alcohol, and go to bed early to be ready for the mission the following day. The next morning, January 1, 1945, the so-called Hermann Order was issued. Named after the ancient Germanic victory in the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, this order marked the beginning of a massive aerial assault. At dawn, more than 900 Luftwaffe aircraft took off from Germany and headed toward France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, with the mission of destroying Allied air forces in the region. In Helmand, due to a navigational error, the Germans attacked an empty airfield and lost 27 aircraft. In Eindhoven, they destroyed 110 Allied planes, losing only 15 of their own. At Gilse and Regen, German jets such as the Arado R-234 and the Messerschmitt 262 launched attacks without causing significant damage. The operation resulted in a tactical victory for the Germans, although the Luftwaffe also suffered significant losses in the process. Operation Bodenplatte was a tactical victory for Germany, but a severe strategic defeat. Despite inflicting heavy losses on the Allies, destroying twice as many planes as the Germans lost, the Luftwaffe was unable to replace its own losses due to a lack of aircraft and trained pilots. Although the operation caused a temporary decrease in the number of Allied flights, the Allies' industrial capacity allowed them to quickly regain air superiority by mid-January 1945. During the attack, in comparison, Germany lost 275 aircraft and 69 were damaged, making the operation, although successful in the short term, have no lasting strategic impact. After the conclusion of Operation Bodenplatte, German forces attempted to hold out in the Ardennes, carrying out minor skirmishes without achieving significant progress. At the same time, US forces focused on dismantling the V-1 and V-2 missile launching ramps, which had been firing on cities like London, Liège and Antwerp. The arrival of the British 70X Corps proved decisive in tipping the balance in favor of the Allies, consolidating their advantage in the region. As January 1945 progressed, the battle became known as the Battle of the Bulge, in which the US Army maintained the initiative and began pushing the Germans back toward their own border. German forces suffered heavy casualties and were forced to withdraw units, such as the 6th SS Panzer Army, which was sent to the Eastern Front to face the Soviet offensive in Hungary. Despite increasing pressure, the German army continued to offer resistance. For example, on January 2nd, 2 King Tiger tanks destroyed 22 American Sherman tanks between Arlencourt and Magaret. The following day, January 3rd, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, destroyed 48 Sherman tanks on the road to Bastogne. However, on January 4th, Patton's Third Army suffered one of its greatest setbacks. when 20 German tanks destroyed 16 Shermans and caused 475 casualties, including dead and captured. Baizori represented the last significant triumph for German forces in the Battle of the Ardennes, when the 26th and 340th Volksgrenadier Divisions managed to take the village and push US troops more than 2 kilometers from their positions. However, this victory was short-lived, as the American counteroffensive began quickly that same day, allowing for the liberation of Baraque de Fréture and Samre. From that point on, Allied forces advanced rapidly, recapturing Bras and breaking through German lines at the Ondenwald Pass on January 15th. Houffalize fell on the 17th, the Sûre River was crossed on the 18th, and Born and Hunningen were occupied on the 20th. The recapture of Saint-Vith and Trois-Verges took place on the 23rd, followed by the incursion into Heinrichsheide on the 24th, and the entry into Wallerode and Weiswampach on the 25th, before the capture of Prumberg on the 27th. Since Axis forces realized that recovering from the defeat in the Ardennes was practically impossible, and facing the danger of being trapped before reaching the Rhine River, the OKW, German High Command, with Adolf Hitler's authorization, ordered a general withdrawal to the initial positions of the offensive launched on December 16, 1944. Thus, most German forces and the Waffen-SS pulled back to the 1944 borders, saving much of their manpower in the process. On January 28, 1945, the German army completely abandoned Belgium and Luxembourg, marking the end of the Battle of the Ardennes,